Greetings, everyone. It is really an honor for me to be here today. And I want to thank Sarah Riley first for inviting me to speak. Thank you, Sarah, and for putting on an amazing conference so far. And I think she deserves a round of applause for what she's done. Yeah. And secondly, I want to thank Ingrid Mendel, who is a partner in this work with me. We have a practice in Canada of acknowledging the peoples, the Indigenous peoples, whose traditional territories we are working on. So today, I would like to acknowledge the people of Wales, whose traditional territories we are holding this conference on, and give thanks for allowing me to be a guest on this land. And I also want to acknowledge that there's a deep and rich storytelling tradition here. And I'm going to be talking about storytelling today. So there's something that resonates, I think, around my area of interest and what I'm doing now in terms of looking at story and where we are. So I'm very excited tonight to hear the storyteller. So today I'm going to reflect on multimedia storytelling, which is a methodology that I've been working to develop along with my colleagues at Revision, the Center for Art and Social Justice at the University of Guelph, which is in Ontario, Canada. And I want to make sure can everyone hear me? I'm projecting enough? Okay, great. So this methodology is one that investigates the power of the arts, and in particular, we focus on storytelling to advance social justice and inclusion through reaching decision makers and practitioners in a variety of sectors. And I've worked with the arts sector, with business, with education, as well as healthcare. I'm going to today sketch out Revision's approach and take you through a process that we use in our work to help support people tell their preferred stories. And this is a process that brings professional into play with community arts. So what I'll do is draw on our collaborative work with queer, Indigenous, racialized, disability identified, and other marginalized and justice-seeking groups to talk about the power of story in 3 acts: story as theory, story as subjectivity, identity, and community, and story as connectivity or relationship. I'll also talk about the potential of well-crafted and well-curated stories to incite change in institutions. I also am going to reflect on how art and how stories teach, not by telling people the right or correct or proper way to think, feel, or be in relationship to difference broadly defined, but through opening up possibilities for living in and with difference. I make the case that creative methodologies can contribute to our qualitative lexicon by offering approaches not only for chronicling marginalized voices and perspectives, but also for scaffolding intersectional and intersectorial alliances. So alliances across positionalities, across communities, between institutions and communities for imagining more just futures. And when I use the term Indigenous in this talk today, I mean I work with Indigenous peoples on the territory that we now call Canada, and the 3 groups of Indigenous folks that I work with are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And Inuit people are the peoples who live in the northern part of Canada. So when I use the term Indigenous, I'm referring to Indigenous people on Turtle Island or North America. So I'm going to introduce this approach with a teaser. And this is a film made in one of our projects. This particular film was made by Carlene Pendleton Jimenez, who's a trans-identified writer and activist. And they tell a story of coming to butch body acceptance and coming to appreciate and love a body that is both strong and sensual.
My mom was a big woman with soft brown breasts and a belly that I clung to. Her mother, my abuelita, told her she was too fat every time we visited. The doctors put her on speed to lose weight by the time she was 14. The man at the food stand gave her less guacamole out of concern for her health. She would cry and yell back at them and teach us kids not to ever say anything bad about a person's body. My mom gave me a gift of a body, part man, part woman, all butch. I've got the emotional insights of estrogen. I can sense a lover's mood from the quickest glimpse into her eyes. I've got the desperate drive of testosterone. I survive on the limp weight of her breast in my mouth, her salt cream panocha under my fingertips. Sometimes I feel like a superhero. Sometimes I feel like an expert, like I could love any woman's body but my own. At 12, I learned I was fat and a girl, both of which were gross. My hard-muscled brother delivered this news to me as he laughed at my bloated, pubescent shape. I stole his black plastic weights to get fit. I didn't want to be fat. I wanted to be strong. I didn't want to be a girl. I wanted to play with the boys. Some of the boys were my best friends. Other kids told me I was some kind of boy-girl joke. At 26, I drew a picture of myself as a monster with breasts, a dick, and a growing stomach, all of which I tried to keep covered. My lover, she told me that she liked witches, especially those with a bit of flesh. I liked that my body was not looked at, but felt. I was a heavy shield holding her safely underneath me. At 43, I wonder about the women parts of me. My buddy sent me the image of Koyo Shauki on my phone. I feel a comfort when I look at her. She's got the exact same chichis as me, big heavy breasts, nipples swelled, facing straight down. Right one bigger than left. A tummy creased and stretched, hanging freely. And she's a goddess. A fallen goddess severed into pieces, but a goddess nonetheless, etched in giant stone for hundreds of years. Someone had to believe she was important for that to happen. Someone must have thought her beautiful.
I'm not going to talk about that film. I'm just going to let it kind of wash over you, and you can think about it and feel it a bit. It gives you a little sense of the work, though. And this work is produced through the Revision Center for Art and Social Justice, which has a mandate to use arts-informed research to create deep understandings of difference that disrupt dominant narratives and open possibilities. So we could see on your left a number of interlinked research projects that I'm involved in, some of which I'm not, but different investigators, different researchers run their projects through revision, and also PhD students work exploring this methodology. And these interlinked research projects really support three thematic areas. First is transforming professional care encounters. The second one is activating feminist and disability creative research practices. And the third one is decolonizing educational relationships and institutions. Now, revision situates its work very much within activist arts traditions over the last 100 years or so in the Anglo kind of Western context, as well as in more emergent critical arts-based approaches. So critical arts-based research is really a collection of methods and methodologies that seek to generate original texts and artifacts using various art-making practices. So people use poetry, they could use theater, they might use film, photography, visual art, etc. And often people who take up the term critical and use critical in front of arts-based research work from postmodern or post-structuralist perspectives as well. They often have an activist orientation, and they're interested in more processual approaches as well. And the way that revision takes this up is that we bring storytelling and social change together, and that is really the heart of our method. And we primarily work in film, although we have worked with theater as well and experimented with theater. Now, although terms such as digital storytelling, ethno-cinema, participatory filmmaking are terms that people use to describe participatory methods using film and video, we have landed on the term multimedia storytelling. And the reason why we've chosen that terminology is because multimedia speaks to that we engage with various media and different genres. So we bring creative writing into our practice. You'll see animation in the film that you just watched. We use photography, movement. So we bring various, sort of art practices into the work. So that's why we use the term multimedia. And we place emphasis on story because we're thinking about the kind of constructed and storied nature of all knowledge claims. Now, so while we recognize this tradition, this pretty recent tradition in visual methodologies and video methodologies, digital methodologies, we also acknowledge that theoretically and epistemologically, the work of centering marginalized perspectives and voices has a much longer lineage. And it's connected to popular education practices. We can think Paulo Freire when we're thinking about popular education practices, critical psychologies, decolonizing movements, and Indigenous people, not only in the North American context, but around the world, reclaiming Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous epistemologies and worldviews through story, and feminist methodology, among others. So we accomplish this work through Red Lab, and Red Lab is a physical space at the university, as well as 3 mobile media labs. In our first 6 years, we've run now close to 100 workshops with various groups for research projects involving people living with disabilities and healthcare providers on challenging the mythical norm that is ubiquitous in healthcare. Whether we're talking about normative minds or normative bodies, there's a kind of mythical norm that floats throughout healthcare and has various effects on people who are non-normatively embodied. We work with Indigenous people and allies, both students, teachers, as well as parents, on decolonizing public schools in Canada, with queer women on speaking back to body image ideals and expected body management practices, and Inuit artists and Inuit communities. Those are the Indigenous people of Canada's North, on building Inuit cultural voice. And a lot of the pictures that you see here are images from various workshops to give you a sense of, sort of how active and interactive the workshops are. And to date, we've generated an archive of over 400 films now, and they've been shown widely. Our stories have traveled. So the stories that have come from Decolonizing Our Schools and the Decolonizing Our Schools collection were featured at an art exhibition that you see here that was held in our provincial legislature building. And we paired the stories that were co-produced by artists and community members with art that was created and developed by emerging and established urban Indigenous artists. And so you're seeing some of the visual artwork that the artists created. And so pairing the stories with artwork and putting them in a gallery that was located in our legislature building. In fact, it was in the same building that senior people from the Ministry of Education inhabit. And we invited all those senior people to come to the gallery and to view the art and to listen to the stories. And we had the Minister of Education and the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs came, and it was out of this art show, this exhibition, that my life partner and my research partner, Susan Dion, who's an Indigenous woman, she's Potawatomi and Lenape, those are two nations in North America. It was out of this show that she was invited to work with the Ministry of Education to help to decolonize the curriculum. So this event did have an impact and continues to, because she's still working with the Ministry of Education. The disability and difference work that we did, the stories have been screened to CEOs and senior medical staff in hospitals across Ontario and Canada. And they caught the attention of the Toronto Arts Council, the Ontario Arts Council, and the Canada Council. And one of the investigators on that project, Eliza Chandler, who's on your left, she was invited by the Ontario Arts Council to do a participatory action research on people with disabilities and the arts and access to the arts. And it was through her writing of that report that the Ontario Arts Council started a special stream for disability arts in Ontario. So the stories, sort of started that process. So you can see some of the impacts that they have had. Now, like other research projects, arts-based research projects, Revision focuses on multimedia storytelling as a research creation and knowledge mobilization method. And I understand from a conversation with Celia yesterday that people talk about knowledge mobilization. I think you use the terms knowledge exchange or knowledge transfer here. We use the work in a similar way, but would also suggest that what makes this approach unique is that we work to blur boundaries between us and them in workshops by bringing together people from justice-seeking groups together with allies who are located in institutions that are implicated in people's oppression. So differently positioned people come together to tell stories and to hear each other's stories. And this helps to begin to scaffold those intersectorial alliances that I talked about at the beginning. We recognize as well that embedded, as we all are, in hegemonic cultural narratives and values, and saturated, as so many of us are, by social media, telling our stories is not enough. And there is a really strong neoliberal impulse for people to tell their stories now. The success of entities like StoryCorps in the US, or the Center for Digital Storytelling, which is now called Story Center. There's kind of a strong impulse for people to tell their stories and to celebrate voice. But from our perspective, simply getting people to tell their stories isn't enough. And that in order to push against dominant framings, we need to create a new curriculum for every project that we take on. And that curriculum investigates what are dominant representations around this issue, what are some of the more conventional or the hegemonic or dominant representations of this issue that circulate not only within mainstream culture, but also within professional cultures or within, sort of the literature around a particular issue. Then we talk about how have artists and activists intervened into these framings. And then we think about how can my story intervene into these framings in some way. So there's a lot of education that happens and a lot of discussion that happens around the stories we tell and thinking about audience and thinking about what is going to be the impact of this story. We build workshops led by marginalized people in order to temporarily shift power dynamics that operate in people's lives. So for some healthcare providers, having a facilitator, a researcher, and artists who live with physical disabilities facilitating their workshops was profoundly transforming, even for people who felt that they already had a social justice lens. We also bring professional and studio-based art into play with participatory and community arts. And we do that for two reasons. The first one is we want to push against the elitism of the art world and make art making something and creativity something that's more accessible to more people. And we also want to up the aesthetics of the work so that all of the stories that you see today are very much co-productions. They're co-produced by artists and storytellers. And we do that in order to increase the likelihood that the work is going to have an impact on intended audiences. And as a result of all of this work, we recently received a grant, which is the largest grant that Canadian funding, the Social Sciences and Humanities funding body gives out. And it's really exciting. We're going to be cultivating non-normative arts in Ontario and studying the effects of the work that gets created and curated and shared with professionals and shared with communities, et cetera. And if you want to find out more about that work, I can talk about it in Q&A. Now, moving from this large umbrella overview of revision, I want to move to talk more deeply about story. And I want to talk about story in 3 acts. Again, story as theory, story as identity, subjectivity, and community, and story as relationship and connectivity. So I personally have been a big fan of stories for a very long time. In a previous life, as Sarah mentioned, I was a clinician at Women's College Hospital in Toronto, and that's a hospital that specializes in women's health issues. And I worked with individuals' narratives of suffering, of trauma and distress, and I worked with both arts-based, therapy methods, as well as narrative therapy was my training. To support people in restoring their experiences and telling and enacting their preferred stories in their lives. Later, my PhD research examined a rich sampling of women's body histories and how these histories entangled with larger cultural narratives that were told about their bodies. So I've worked with stories probably for 30 years. But I still have a hard time figuring out how to theorize stories. And I think maybe I have Cherokee writer Thomas King to blame for this. And Thomas King is a well-known Canadian Indigenous writer. He's an essayist and a novelist. And he's the one who tells us the truth about stories is that that is all we are. If that's the case, How do we start? What are we really theorizing if we're made up of stories? Following Indigenous traditions in the Americas, King views stories not solely as entertainment, but as carriers of people's knowledge and values, as speech acts that have the power to make and change the world. I start with King because scholars interested in storytelling as a methodology often frame this approach as relatively new, as emerging from post-structuralism, for example, emerging from qualitative research methods, for example, emerging from narrative theory. What remains unacknowledged here is that Indigenous peoples have for centuries understood story as theory, as encoding people's worldviews and as conveying their deepest beliefs about the world. So building on this understanding, King goes on to remind us, stories are wondrous things and they are dangerous. Stories are dangerous because, one could argue that every knowledge claim is a story, and it's a story about some phenomenon. And when we make knowledge claims, and when those knowledge claims are taken up by others and turned into practices, they have the power to affect people's lives in profound ways. So, Chimamanda Adichie, the Nigerian, Kenyan British writer, also writes of the wonders and dangers of stories, and she emphasizes the perils of the single story, and that is the repeatedly told story that's told so often that it becomes the primary way an individual or group is identified. And I love this quote from a TED Talk of hers. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but rather that they are incomplete. They make the one story the only story. So, our revision, we investigate and consider two intriguing and pressing questions related to this problematic. The first is, how do we move past the dominant narrative without producing a single counter story that similarly ensnares us, so that we're caught in a kind of binary? And how do we listen to each other and reflect deeply on the implications of the stories we tell? Well, we think about the ethics of telling, and we think about the ethics of listening. So now I'm going to show a film that reflects on the theory work that stories do, how stories teach us to think, and the material effects they have in our lives. Hildy Zitzelsberger's My Impossible Invulnerability contemplates how we all occupy multiple positions in our lives and how claiming a marginalized identity can entrap us into a confined space that is not of our own choosing. She asks us to question how we might tell and hear vulnerable stories in ways that don't collapse people into simple categories of difference, or oversimplify how we work and love in the world as both insecure and self-assured, broken and healed. Was it too loud the last story that was played? No, it was a little bit. Monsieur, can you tell me how to turn the sound down a bit?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can do it on there.
Okay.
I mean, that will do the same thing.
Okay.
But do you want it?
Is that okay? Yeah? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. My impossible invulnerability. I am an aromatherapist, nurse, professor, hairstylist, researcher, yoga practitioner. Some of my best friends are dogs. I need to be in open, green spaces. I need air. I wonder about the stories that we continue to tell each other, and how this traps some of us into bearing the burdens of a messy and so-called problematic body, while allowing others the illusion of mastery and control. As a nurse and patient, student and a professor, research participant and researcher, what side of the bed, lecture at our desk am I supposed to be on? When I teach students about vulnerable persons or populations, why do none of us admit this is who we all are? If we do own it, why does this become all we are? Standing in front of a class trying to move students to be touched by suffering. When I reveal my own pain, how am I seen? What do I become? When my own pain becomes visible, does others disappear? How can I feel attractive and self-assured, but scared to strip off my protective layers in front of a stranger, my doctor, a friend, my sister, my lover? I feel so much self-judgment when I reveal my failures, shame when I reveal my imperfections. But I feel so alive in my skin when I do.
So stories not only carry ideologies and discourses, they also author us and give us the means to author ourselves. We live the stories that get planted in us, and we also live the stories we plant in ourselves and others. This cross-fertilization of stories seeded by others and stories germinated by us is what allows us to cultivate distinct subjectivities and identities, shared identities, to create and express difference, even as we create and express community and culture. This brings me to another reason that I'm invested in storytelling. Stories and storytelling makes us vulnerable. It makes us ask questions about who we are and who we should be. Makes us take risks and go to vulnerable places. Now we know in the current era that vulnerability is very much connected with weakness, and it's associated with wounding and being open to attack, and being open and susceptible to being hurt by others. But neoliberal ideals of subjectivity and personhood, which, promote this idealized, invulnerable, autonomous, strong human being, don't acknowledge is that we need vulnerability in order to express and receive caring, in order to be understood and to understand. We need vulnerability for intimacy. We need vulnerability for growth and development. Vulnerability scaffolds the possibility for belonging and for community. So I'd like to tell you a story about the power of vulnerability in collaborative storytelling as research method. I got the idea for revision in 2007 after making my first story in a storytelling workshop for women living with disabilities and differences. And this was part of a research project that I was the lead investigator on. And I was inviting a group of women who had non-normative embodiments to talk about their embodied experience of disability and difference. And I knew that if I was asking participants to go to really vulnerable places with each other and with me, I had to do the same thing. I had to go to those places. So I made a film called The Elephant in the Room, and this was the first time through this collective experience that I was able to authentically kind of come out about my own bodily difference and to story who I was authentically in relationship to that research project. So that was a really important self-reflexive exercise and moment for me. Now, although I see my story and all the stories created through revision as authentic representations, I no longer am the person I was when I made that story. I made that story in 2007, and it's 2017, it was 10 years ago. When I watched that story, I am no longer her. That is an earlier representation of me. It is an authentic representation. I was grappling to come to the truth of, to a truth at that moment in time, and in that place. But a lot of things have changed in my life, and I'm no longer that person. This highlights for me the many layered meanings of revision. So I borrowed this word from feminist poet and essayist Adrienne Rich, who in a well-known 1972 essay describes revision thusly. Ooh, sorry about that. Revision, the act of looking back, of seeing with fresh eyes, of entering an old text from a new critical direction, is for women and other justice-seeking groups more than a chapter in cultural history. It is an act of survival. Until we can understand the assumptions in which we are drenched, we cannot know ourselves. Okay, so one can take Rich's interpretation here to mean uncovering an authentic truth hidden behind false assumption, right? And this is, I think, what she meant when she wrote this. This is a version of revision that equates vision with truth, and we know the problematics of that. It is also possible to glean another meaning from the word revision. So rather than fixing or correcting past falsehoods to reveal a hidden truth, revision can be understood as a continuous process of revisiting, rethinking, and reworking, of understanding the self, identity, community as a culture as a continuous process of change and continuous process of becoming. I'm now going to share with you a story that grapples with themes of identity, subjectivity, and community. The name of the story is Value Village, and it's by a disability-identified artist called Jan Derbyshire. And Jan is an artist who identifies with the experience of hearing voices. And those of us who know the DSM would know how that would be clinically categorized. She tells us the story of a surprising thrift store find. What she discovers by listening to the story told by this find, which is a psychotropic medication that she finds in a discarded handbag, leads her to contemplate the dominance of biomedical and pharmaceutical scripts and the ways we might use sequence and a sense of rhythm to resist them.
I like to go to Value Village to listen to what the things that people leave behind might have to say. One day, I found a bag in housewares for $3.99, full of prescription bottles, all labeled for Mrs. Green, who lived in Winnipeg in the 70s. I took them home to see what they had to tell me.
Can't help wondering if Mrs. Green was onto something. The world would be a much more beautiful place if we were prescribed sequins instead of pills.
Okay. So this brings me to the third act of storytelling, which is relationship. While many discussions of storytelling for social change focus on the importance of telling our stories, so there's a celebration of voice, of talking back to dominant narratives, so there's a celebration of resistance. What we find equally important in our work is that this process, what this process does, what the process of bringing people together in a group does to recenter the necessity of listening. You know, so we can celebrate voice and we can celebrate, sort of people speaking back against dominant discourses all we want, but unless we're also thinking about listening and how we create the conditions of possibility for listening, sort of that is limited in its capacity to help to make change. So by bringing people together in a group context and by bringing people together from different positionalities in a group context telling stories, we create space for shared creativity as well as mutual accountability. So people work with each other in crafting the stories, and people speak from their own vantage points when they're giving other people feedback about their stories. So the focus is on individuals crafting stories, but doing so in a group context that emphasizes our independence on each other. So this is not a DIY or do-it-yourself approach to culture making, but rather it is a group process that makes plain and clear the interconnected and collaborative enterprise of story making. You can only tell a story if you have somebody listening to you, if you have a listener. So it presumes relationship, and we want to make that explicit and talk about the ethics of both telling and listening. A question we often pose during our workshop process is, what is our responsibility as listeners to the stories that are shared? This responsibility requires multiple kinds of listening, holding participants' individual journeys as they voice their experiences, thinking about the institutional and political listening necessary as these stories are, to use Thomas King's words, loosed into the world, and considering the implications of the stories for policy. In all cases, our responsibility extends beyond individual storytellers to acknowledging our own positioning in systems and the forces that structure our listening. Hello. Oh, that's my timer. I'm almost done. It is from sustained listening across difference that intersectional and intersectorial alliances have emerged in many of our projects. So for some people with disabilities, for example, it was the first time they were in a room with a healthcare provider where they weren't scared, right? It was the first time they felt like they could have a conversation with a healthcare provider. For some of the Indigenous people, It's the first time that they were in a space, like some of the images that I flashed when I was talking about how the stories traveled. It was the first time some of those people had been in an art gallery. And what enabled them to enter that space was the fact that there were community stories in there. Like this was a space that was being turned into a community space. And, you know, as a result, trustees and senior people from, you know, sort of school boards and ministry officials, like, actually spoke with people from communities, from Indigenous communities, often for the first time. So I'm going to end with a story that emphasizes interconnectivity of storytelling, and it was made by an Inuit artist called Ruben Komanjipak. And Ruben returns the colonial gaze by staging here a reverse ethnography that makes a spectacle of white ways of knowing, using humor to draw attention to the hegemony of English, the English language, and the hegemony of the written word, as well as the hegemony of, you know, sort of anthropological ways of knowing the other. Here, Ruben subverts the storytelling genre's emphasis on storytelling as a solitary or scripted enterprise through joining with other Inuit storytellers who were in the workshop to improvise a collective telling and a returning of the colonial gaze.
Anak kami yang kami ada donasi di universitas.
So, in conclusion, I want to say a little bit about the pedagogical possibilities of this work. So, I've become interested through this project in how art and story teach. And I think that without telling people what to think or feel, I'm interested in how art makes people think and feel, moving and affecting audiences to indeterminate ends. Drawing on the work of Deleuze, Elizabeth Gross reflects on the power of art to disrupt our gut-level reactions and to provoke new visceral responses to things. And she writes, "Art is not frivolous and indulgence or luxury. It is the most vital and direct form of impact on and through the body, the generations of vibratory waves, rhythms that traverse the body and make of the body a link with it, with forces it cannot otherwise perceive and act upon." She suggests that art may operate at a different register from science or philosophy, by opening up emergent, unpredictable alternatives for knowing difference. Thinking with Gross, revision stories may work in some contexts as becoming pedagogies that offer non-didactic and open-ended possibilities for living with and in difference. While non-instructional, these stories still teach insofar as they offer new possibilities for living. So I'm going to end by posing a few questions that we are puzzling over at the moment. And one of them is how we can capture the impact of arts-based research and research creation methods. And I think people are going to talk about this in another keynote. I think Celia's going to talk about impacts. So it's something that I'm thinking about a lot, is how to create ways of capturing impacts that are not focused on the cognitive, that are not focused on changing the way people think, but are more focused on trying to capture what are the affects, sort of what are the emotions and what are the sensations that some of this work and other work may stir up in people. So trying to understand movements and shifts in people at a more effective level. How do we center individuals' voices while still making visible the political processes and the systemic inequities that often invisibly shape selves and social relations? How do we center individuals' voices in ways that don't fuel depoliticized neoliberal notions of hyper-individuality? This is a question that I think about a lot in doing this work. How do we present this work ethically and artistically? I also think about this question, like the potential for many of these pieces to be misread is huge. And so, sort of I and other researchers think a lot about, how do we frame these stories and how do we kind of protect them in some ways? How do we share them with audiences? How do we make sure they find the right audiences? And then how might art open up necessary political and often hidden conversations about embodied and in-minded difference, about colonization and racialization, about fatness, about aging, about trauma, about suffering, and about death. So I am going to end there. Thank you so very much for your time. Thank you. Thank you.